Thank you. So this presentation was given at the Lighthouse meeting earlier this year in Queensland, but I've made quite a few modifications to it. So all of these issues are always on my mind, and I'm constantly learning about Indigenous culture and the issues of Indigenous health that confront all of us in our clinical practice in what we're trying to achieve. And I really am at the beginning of my learning, and I've been doing it for about 20 years. And so trying to understand the context of Aboriginal health in this country is really challenging because there are so many different tribal groups, there are so many different states of colonisation, and trying to understand Indigenous paradigm hasn't really been a part of Australian culture ever. So when I went to primary school, there was certainly no Aboriginal curriculum, and so I'm on a learning journey myself. And after speaking to Anthea yesterday and hearing that it was being recorded, I realised that I needed to do a little bit more research into some of the local elders and the information I was going to talk to you about today. So this presentation is actually quite a different content, although a lot of the slides are the same from that Lighthouse presentation that I gave. And essentially what I'm trying to get across is my growing understanding of the different paradigms that we all live in, parallel universes really, and the beauty and mystery of life. And I'm going to try and make you think about questioning the Western paradigm of science and making room for other paradigms, because this is what I see as the missing link with Aboriginal health. And if we're going to close any gaps, then we need to do it on the terms of the people whose gap we're going to close, and we must understand them. And the more that I understand Aboriginal people and culture, the more that I respect and regard it, and the more the deeper the riches are within that culture. And I feel like I'm in a very privileged position here at Katherine Hospital. So Katherine is obviously in the north of Australia. It's an enormous landmass, 350 square kilometres. And I moved here 6 years ago. I was always intrigued by the area, but to me it represents this opportunity to work with Aboriginal people from over 20 different tribal areas in a really remote location. And that, to me, it is the heartland of Indigenous issues. So the population of the Katherine region is roughly 25,000 people. Half of them are Aboriginal. And as I said, there's over 20 languages spoken in the main street still today. So it's quite a unique place. The landmass is the same size as one Victoria and two Tasmanians, and there's 2 physicians and a 60-bed hospital in the middle, and that's where I'm presenting from today. Over time, I have changed the way I've seen this landscape. And it's been in the last 15 to 20 years that I've been working in the Northern Territory, and particularly in the last 6 years as a more senior doctor, really committed to Katherine Hospital and getting to know the patients that I work for. And so Katherine is in the middle of an area. It's a new town in the middle of an ancient area that has recently proved in Arnhem Land by anthropologists 65,000 years of human habitation. And you really need to get your head around that. So these people that I work for, their ancestors were here before the last ice age started and after the last ice age finished. There's stories along the coastlines of the Yolngu people and the Guingu people that I've heard of when the oceans rose. And they came up over a period of about 200 years, and apparently at the peak of the oceans rising, the 130 metres at the end of last ice age, they were moving up, making inways into what was previously inhabited land of up to 2 kilometres per year. So it was a very dramatic event that happened some 13,000 years ago, and it is still very much in ancestral stories, and it is a recorded history that has absolute legitimacy. And there's a lot of stories and culture that is integrally associated with a profound understanding of the land that only comes with living in the land in perpetuity for 65,000 years. It's something that modern day people, all of us from the West, really fail to comprehend. We're so distracted by technology and by our physical built environments, our urban environments, that we fail to recognise that we live on the earth and that the earth is something that's constantly in flux. Aboriginal people still understand that in ways that I'm only just starting to comprehend, and in ways that have deep and complete meaning in harmony with the country, and often, in fact, usually come into conflict with the way that the Western way of thinking in Australia is enforced upon them. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But I'll give you an example of how I'm starting to understand this country. And I really need to emphasize I'm not Indigenous. I'm just somebody that's interested in learning about the history of the part of Australia that I'm now living in. So recently I drove, I don't know, can you see my mouse down here on the screen? So I recently drove, so here we are in Katherine. I recently drove from, here's Katherine. I recently drove from Timber Creek, which is right down here past the Victoria River. So I drove in a line that basically follows the cursor now from Nariman country through the top of Nulliwuru country into Waterman country and across into Jawoyn country. And I'd picked up an old man at Timber Creek. And as I drove him back to Katherine, we talked, and I mean, it was mainly in English, but I've tried to learn a bit of Nulliwuru. I'm not very good at language, but I'm trying my best. And he described to me on the way all of the landmarks and all of the borders between tribal boundaries. And he talked of sacred sites and gave me a little bit of insight into the history behind each of these sacred sites. Of course, this is in a 3-hour drive, so it was a 3-hour lesson for me. And what was particularly interesting when we finally arrived into Jawoyn country, I remember I've heard stories that in Katherine 30 or 40 years ago, Nariman people from Timber Creek area would have spear fights with the Jawoyn people. This was in the 1980s, and so I said to him, in the olden days, you had to have certain processes and protocols when you pass through other people's country, and here we are in a Toyota moving at 130 kilometres an hour along a highway. What's your perspective of modern day relationships between these tribal groups? Because these boundaries that you see, all of these tribal boundaries that you see, were very, very clear as the boundaries in Europe. And to me, the tapestry of Europe is just as rich, even within my Katherine region. And he said to me, well, in the last 100 years since the old days, things have changed dramatically now, and my nephew has married a Walpuri lady from the Tanami Desert, and I've got family from East Arnhem Land, and we've realised that we have a lot more that is shared, and a lot of our challenges in coming to terms with the new Western world is shared, and so those traditional tribal tensions are much less than they were. And we all live in a contemporary and changing society, including the Aboriginal people that I look at. And there is a contemporary and fascinating side to this country. And this tapestry map that I show before you is very much alive. And the people who identify with these tribes are part of our contemporary Australia. And so I feel very privileged to be living at the heart of it and to be understanding what it is at the moment. So to understand what it is at the moment, you also have to understand the history, and I spoke a little bit about this at the Lighthouse Forum. In the 1870s, the first settlers came up towards Darwin with the overland telegraph line, and they also were bringing cattle in, and they came from far north in Queensland. When they came unsupervised by the police. In fact, if they were an early settler, they were deputised as the police officer. And the common practice was to kill all the men in a tribe to prevent a threat being made to the white people who were far in the minority. And so it was a very murderous and violent interaction right through to the early 1900s, when the violence started to subside and when some politicians in Adelaide started to call an end to the violence. However, it left a lot of these tribes, the Nulakan, the Mara, the Alawa, and including the Jawoyn, very, very decimated. So across to the east here, you'll see that a lot of these languages have been lost. And in fact, one of my jobs, one of the patients I looked after was to palliate the last living speaker of the Mara language. So over half of all of the world's languages have disappeared in the last 100 years. And I saw one of those languages disappear myself. And I felt very privileged to be able to see that old lady and to talk to her and hear her tongue. But this part of the colonisation has decimated a lot of cultural practices. When you look across to East Arnhem Land, the Yolngu people had been trading with Chinese people, trading trepang with Indonesians and Chinese for up to 2,000 years, and they were a pretty savvy bunch, and they were very warlike, and they defended their territory robustly, and many white police were killed out in Arnhem Land, and that was the basis on which Arnhem Land was formed in 1930 when Donald Thompson came up here to essentially form a treaty with the Yolngu people. So I look after a lot of Yolngu people from the bottom part of East Arnhem Land, and they all speak fluent Yolngu, and they have very strong language and cultural practices. Their cultural practices are paramount, and it's really hard to explain how deep that is. But if you've worked with somebody that was born in Greece and still predominantly spoke Greek, well, these people are even more complex in their cultural approach, and it's more different to the Western mind than any Greek ever will be, and it's really hard to get your mind around what culture means, but the longer you try, the more you actually start to understand. Looking across to the west of Katherine, that was settled after the 1920s, and it was very much cattle country. And so all of the people that I look after out to the west were, you know, anyone that's over the age of about 45 was a stockman and was very proud of being a stockman. There are very interesting changes in demographics and workplace with the introduction of equal pay. And there's a sense of pride in their horsemanship for people out to the west almost invariably. However, it's a double-edged sword. So everyone that I speak to about the old days say that they were all treated very poorly, and the horsewhip was the tool used by the white cattle station owners to rein in people for what they deemed misbehaviour, once again unpoliced. It wasn't until 1955 that a Manggarai family down here was severely beaten by their cattle station owner, and he went to jail for 3 years. He was the first person to be charged with assaulting an Aboriginal person in the history of contact between 1870 and 1955. So you get a sense that anyone born before 1955 and probably right up to 1975 was subjected to white violence. And so then right down the bottom here, actually, down the very southernmost part, I fly out to Larjamanu and Kaukarenji, and the Warlpiri people of the Tanami Desert were the last people to be contacted, and there's probably about 30 or 40 old people that I know out there who remember the first day they met white people. In fact, I was told a story recently about by an old man out there who told me when they found the tracks of a Toyota Land Cruiser in their country, they thought it was two rainbow serpents traversing their land, and they ran and hid because they didn't know what to make of these marks in the ground. And so this is a Katherine that I am starting to know and understand, but it takes a lot of effort, and I'm in a very, very privileged position of having old people every day. So 70% of the admitted patients to Katherine Hospital are Aboriginal, and they are all delighted to try and help me understand their heritage and their culture. So I get lessons every day, and that's my privilege. And not many people have that privilege, even within this town itself. So you have to be in a town long enough to be trusted for a start, because there's a lot of mistrust from Aboriginal people with white people. And then you have to be in a position where you actually come into contact regularly with Aboriginal people in a way that you can develop trust, and that is what a doctor does. So Katherine's right in the middle of it, and understanding the town and understanding what's happening here to Aboriginal people really has a national, in fact, I think it has an international context as well. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So my children go to one of the local schools where roughly half of the children are Indigenous. And when my kids started, I was horrified to realise that none of those, that none of those children's cultural heritage was recognised by the Department of Education, and the curriculum was 0% Indigenous. There was no Aboriginal context in which they were learning. And so as I've gotten to know Aboriginal people in this town, I've been told on numerous occasions that most of the Aboriginal parents felt that the school was trying to brand itself as a white fella school and tried to make Aboriginal people feel uncomfortable. They didn't even have an Aboriginal flag flying. And so these parents were forced to send their kids to school, because if they didn't send their kids to school, then welfare would be onto them to take their kids away. This is what's actually happening in Katherine and many other towns across Australia. So our education system is decimating culture. No one learns language. In fact, one of the teachers recently told me that they were planning on introducing language to the school. I said, oh, that's really fantastic. And she said, yeah, we're going to introduce Italian and Greek. I said, oh, wow, amazing, thanks. It's great to see that a government department is so in tune with the needs of the community. Aboriginal culture is used to being bulldozed, and it's still happening. And so there's obviously a lot of advocacy that needs to happen. And there's so many issues in towns like Katherine, it's really hard to know where to start. And, you know, for me professionally, I'm a doctor and I do the best that I can, but it rings throughout the community. So I'll give you some examples of what I mean. And it's not all bleak. In fact, there's a lot of beauty, and we're all trying to come to terms with who we are and what we mean in this universe. So this is a view from my veranda. And the black escarpment you can see there is the Arnhem Land escarpment, and this is in the wet season. In the dry season, it all goes brown and yellow, and every bit of green disappears. So I recently had an old man and his family come over for dinner, and he comes over quite regularly. So down on the back of my property is the Katherine River, and he and his family go down there fishing, and to thank me, they come up and we cook a fish and we eat, and my kids get to hang out with his kids, and it's a very lovely and privileged position that I have to be able to have friends like this. He's an elder, a Dullabon elder, and this storm blew over. And when the storm blew over, there was lightning and thunder and heavy rain, and Manuel and his wife, particularly his wife and sister-in-law, became very frightened. And I could see him, my kids could see him. For us, it's a time of excitement and joy when a storm comes over. But in this part of Australia, the Namagon is the spirit of the sky, the spirit of thunder, and he's angry. He's angry that somebody stole his spears from the bottom of a tree. And so when you hear him roaring overhead, you go away from trees, because he will hit the trees with his hammer, and it makes a terrific bang and a spark. And I keep making the mistake with Aboriginal people of thinking that their mythical stories are understood to be mythical, but they are not. They are literal. And this family knew that Namargon was over our head and was throwing lightning around. And they didn't know how to conceptualize a modern day house, or a wanga, as they say. What do you do with a wanga? Does Namargon hit a wanga, or does he only hit trees? And so I tried to explore this with Emmanuel and his family, and it's a very literal interpretation. This is their belief, full stop. You can't stop someone believing in something just because you want them to. And why should we be trying to make someone stop believing in something when really the world is an enormous mystery? The universe that we live in has much more mystery than not. And Western science is extremely powerful. But it is one-dimensional, and it misses out on many other dimensions, and it misses the richness and beauty of a culture that's formed over 65,000 years around the earth. So after this storm receded, Manuel started telling me about Bulang. Bulang is the rainbow serpent. And once again, Manuel explained to me that Bulang once travelled down the river. And there's sections of the river where you're allowed to fish. There's sections of the river where you're not allowed to go. There's sections of the river where pregnant women are not allowed to swim. And it is very, very clearly demarcated. And it is an absolute law. And it is still respected, absolutely. And the value in that law is real. So by valuing this law and understanding it, through mythical concepts and through 65,000 years of understanding, people came to realize that by looking after the land in a certain way, their culture could continue. And it's a pretty harsh environment. So for them to have been able to navigate that and to utilize it really. So if anyone's interested in understanding how Aboriginal people farmed the land, there was a lot of technique. It really was a form of farming that it has now really essentially been recognised as land management. And so Bulang is everywhere. And Manuel warned me that my section of the river, I had to be very respectful of Bulang and I should never swim there. This is Gabanmang, and Gabanmang is the equivalent of the Louvre in Paris. It is a 48,000-year-old art gallery. It's hidden. Aboriginal people didn't tell white people where it was. A white helicopter pilot found it in 1992 and landed there, and then the Jawan people acknowledged that it existed, but they will not let any white people go there. There's been an archaeological dig there, and it's found sediments that are at least 45 to 50,000 years old. And it was a cave that was made by people, and this is the underneath of the cave. There's no denying that Aboriginal culture had a richness that was probably a lot richer than our own culture. And it was very much linked to the earth, and it wasn't celebrated in big ceremonies and internationally. It was a real culture based around knowledge of locality. And around Catherine, if you're lucky enough, you end up getting invited to places like this. But it's unfortunately for all of us, and maybe this is something that Aboriginal people need to come to terms with, is that we all now inhabit this land as well, and we need to be able to access this kind of stuff. But unless you're trusted, you're not allowed to access it. And so here we are at a bit of an impasse where people who don't live in towns like Catherine really will never get this kind of exposure. So I'll kind of reflect now on who I am, because I think it's really important in this context. And I really want to once again very clearly say that I'm not talking on behalf of Aboriginal people. I'm talking on behalf of my perception of what I see, which is only the seed of an understanding. My ancestors came to Australia in 1840, and this is the top of Quilty's Mountain. My grandfather took me here when I was a small boy, and he moved some of the rocks around because he thought that they were misplaced. And I can assure you that that would have been very frowned upon by Aboriginal people. But my grandfather was trying to do the right thing. I'm not saying that in my family history I haven't had ancestors that probably weren't violent to Aboriginal people. Anyone that's had more than 4 or 5 generations of family in Australia probably does have some things that are less than ideal in the way that our ancestors treated Aboriginal people. But it was events like this that really triggered an interest for me in Aboriginal people. So the people that made this rock formation had long since gone, and there would never be an explanation. And so when you really think about who we are as a people, as a Western people, it comes from ancient Greece, from philosophers and scientists, from Aristotle and beyond. And it's been 5,000 to 6,000 years in the making. And the form of logic that we all have, indeed the science that we have, has taken thousands of years to embed itself to be able to be on this video link today. We've mastered a particular understanding of the universe that's allowed us to communicate like this today. And it's all thanks to our Greek ancestors. but are we going in the right direction? I'm serious. Are we going in the right direction? There's recently been a moratorium on fracking in the Northern Territory, and that's been removed, as if more carbon emissions into our atmosphere doesn't matter. We have Donald Trump as our president, president of the world, maybe. And Aboriginal people live in this world as well. This is all of our world together. And I don't think science has got it right at all. I think that science is leading us on a one-way course to annihilation of humanity. And many Aboriginal people in the region believe that very firmly. And it's because, and I'll explain to you in a little while, why the Aboriginal people in Katherine are concerned that the end of the world is coming. But I think that their understanding, their philosophy, their need to hold on to knowledge and hand it from generation to generation over 60,000 years gave them an intimacy with nature and a respect for nature that we simply can't have because we weren't born into that culture. We were born into a culture that was Western. And so a little bit more about Katherine Hospital and what we've achieved. And I'm talking about all of this because I think fundamental to the achievements is a growing understanding within our Katherine Hospital community that recognising Aboriginal culture and listening to it is paramount if we're going to close the gap. So Katherine Hospital is right up on the edge of the Katherine River on the northern end of town. It's the only hospital in Australia that has a fence to keep the crocodiles out in the wet season. Got a beautiful campus with tropical gardens surrounding it, and it's very laid back. 60 beds. We see roughly 18,000 people a year through the ED, and we have roughly 1,700 admitted patients under the medical team per year. The Katherine population is arguably the most deprived in Australia. The only other place in Australia that could come close to Katherine is Tennant Creek. So this is these photos that were taken by my cousin Andrew Quilty. He followed a group of people around for 2 weeks with his camera, and this man has lived on the edge of the Katherine River for the last 10 years, and he's been under the false assumption that his accommodation application, his housing application, was still valid when in fact it wasn't. And so he uses the river to swim and to drink and to clean. And so the problem of homelessness is really fundamental to what Katherine is, and it's a strange kind of homelessness. So I've heard some anthropologists say that it's a quasi-normal state for Aboriginal people who like to live under the stars, but I think the problem is that since Aboriginal people were displaced for their land, no one's bothered to try and help them reinvent what life in contemporary Australia means, and so they live. They all live in profoundly substandard accommodation. You only need to walk down a few streets at night on a Katherine evening to witness it. So in the Northern Territory, 7% of people are homeless. This is all This is a program run by the ABC Online, and the Katherine region is highlighted in yellow because we have the highest homelessness rates in Australia at 13%. And when you consider that almost every single person that's homeless in Katherine is Aboriginal, means that 1 in 4 Aboriginal people in the Katherine region are homeless. To put that in perspective, the town of Katherine, which has 10,000 people, has the same number of homeless people as the whole of the inner areas of Sydney, including the inner west. A town the size of probably one high-rise building. And so to contextualise that, this is what the homelessness looks like compared to the tiny little Western Australian dot down the bottom. So contemporary Australia for Aboriginal people living in Katherine is very uncomfortable. And when you're talking about medicating people for complex diseases, it's very problematic. And these people are really lost, and I kind of refer to them as refugees in their own land. They've been displaced from their own land. They're not allowed to go back. They're forced out of their communities, and so they come into Katherine where they don't have a home. So if you're a young man in Katherine and you are in Nooka, for instance, a young Aboriginal man in Nooka, and you aspire to be a tradesman, you can never move to Katherine because there's no accommodation for you. The wait list for a young man to get public housing is probably around about 10 years. And so people are forced to stay in their community of origin or to move to Katherine to be homeless. There's no in between, and there's no private accommodation for Aboriginal people. And certainly if I owned a house in Katherine, I wouldn't rent it to an Aboriginal person because it would quickly be full of 20 people living in there, and modern day houses aren't meant for 20 people and they quickly fall apart. And that is the sad reality of Katherine. And it's also fundamentally the challenge of treating these people. So we have some of the highest rates, for instance, of rheumatic heart disease in Australia. And I'd been in Katherine for about 12 months and I'd met a young man who was a few years my junior who had severe mitral stenosis from rheumatic heart disease. And I was working with him and he was starting to comply with his medications, and we started to talk about the possibility of him jumping into the dark unknown and going down to Adelaide for valve replacement. And he was doing pretty well. He was compliant with his warfarin and his diuretics and his beta blocker. And in January, he came in one day, once again decompensated, and acknowledged that he hadn't taken his medications for a couple of weeks. And this man in his mid-30s, I felt quite angry with him. I said, mate, you know, you're going to die. Why don't you take your tablets? And I expressed my anger, accidentally probably, but he said to me, Simon, a couple of weeks ago there was that big storm and it blew a branch down out of a tree and it ripped a hole in my tent, and then that big storm that followed it filled my tent up with water and my dosette box got wet and I felt too ashamed to go and get another box. And so here I am demanding a homeless man to value my medicines more than the fact that he's living in a tent in the tropics. Until you've sorted out the issues of housing and what it means to have a home for a contemporary Aboriginal person, I don't think we're going to close any gaps. And so this is just a map of Warlpiri transient camps that I like to show. Does anyone know what a transient camp is? It's where people go when they're not welcome. It's in the middle of Katherine. It's horrendous. It is like a refugee camp that's had nobody care for it for 20 years. And this was the answer when in the 1950s, a new town was made called Lajamanu in the Tanami Desert, and they forcibly removed half of the population from Kintor and Yundamu to Lajamanu. Lajamanu was closer to Katherine than anywhere else, and so Katherine gradually became a service town. And the town council didn't like all of these Warlpiri people coming up from the desert and wanted to discourage it. And so on the outskirts of Katherine, they made this transient camp, and they quite obviously, purposefully made it very uncomfortable. And people are in the dry season at the moment, there'll be 400 or 500 people living in the 20 or so houses that are there. And it is appalling. And these people are proud and wonderful people. And they have never known anything but homelessness or severely overcrowded housing, and they just accept the lot that they've given without questioning it. So this is me as a child in the southern part of the Tanami, and maybe once again this is why I'm in Katherine, I'm not quite sure. All of these kids that I met as a child didn't speak English. They lived in a tiny little encampment on the edge of a desert billabong, and they were very warm and welcoming, and we spent a couple of days with them. And sadly, when you reflect on what these kids would be doing now, they'd all be my age, and probably maybe half of them would not be here any longer. And these kids were born into an Australia where, so they probably would have been born in their home community. They would have been born into an Australia where it was known that white men were there, and so we wouldn't have come as a complete surprise when we arrived. But they had pretty limited contact with white people and with Western society, and they still do. And to give you a bit of context about the kind of life that they grew up in, I tell the crow story. I think the crow story really makes you realise what 65,000 years of generation after generation living in the landscape does to the mindset and to the relationship that a human being has with its environment. So when I was a young man, I spent a bit of time out in Far East Arnhem Land, and I worked. I got to know a family out there, and they took me out hunting, and we were out sitting down after an unsuccessful hunt, um, and Jimmy, the old man, was walking towards us. I wasn't allowed to go hunting because I'm a white fella and I smell and I'm too noisy. So I had to sit with the ladies and weave, which didn't do anything for my masculinity. But uh, we were sitting there waiting for Jimmy and Timothy to come through the bush. And Helen said to me, "Oh, Simon, they're here." And I said, "Oh, how do you know that?" She said, "Oh, here's our crows." And I said, "Oh, what crows?" And then Helen told me this crow story. And sure enough, Jimmy walks out of the bush. Jimmy and Timothy come out of the bush without anything. And the crows had followed them along. So the crows had followed us out to this campsite. They'd followed Jimmy and Timothy out whilst they went hunting, and they'd come back. And they went on to explain to me that when a couple is married, the marriage ceremony is around the breeding cycle of the crows. And when you get married, you have a pair of crows that come and live with you for the rest of your life. So the pair of crows pairs up with a pair of humans. And the crows warn you, they tell you when there's prey around, they tell you when there's predators around, and they live with you side by side. And I realized when I watched Timothy and Jimmy walking out of the bush that if you live in a world where no one has ever moved faster than a pair of legs can carry them, it is completely understandable that a pair of crows will be able to keep up with them for their entire life. And it gets a lot deeper than this, much deeper than any of us will ever understand, because it's not just you that's lived with these crows, it's your parents that have handed it on to you for 65,000 generations, 65,000 years of generations, many tens of thousands of generations before you, who've learnt to live in harmony and to understand the nature of the crow and to value that crow as a part of the environment. So to understand Aboriginal people's context of health and well-being, it is not ego, it is not individual, it is tribal, and it is land, and it is landscape, and it is animals. And the laws that they had around the universe in which they lived were all about sustaining everything. It wasn't just about a human being being healthy, it was about their whole land being healthy, because one human being never mattered. One human being was not worthwhile to the whole tribe. To keep the tribe moving in perpetuity over 65,000 years, there's a whole lot of pragmatism that needs to be manifest. And that pragmatism comes as a learning of your environment and a deep and intertwined connection with animals in ways that we really don't understand. And I've worked in remote communities before, and I've seen some pretty mysterious things. And there are other dimensions to the way we can consider the universe that are completely dismissed by science and are strongly held as real by Aboriginal people. And until we can start to bridge that gap, and until we can start learning from Aboriginal people, we're not going to close any gaps. So what can we do? And I saw Katherine Hospital as a real opportunity. I had my eye on it when I was doing physicians training, and I desperately wanted to take it on. It was a pretty dysfunctional hospital. In fact, in 2010, it nearly shut because they couldn't staff it. The juniors that all went here were terrified because it is a scary place. There's a lot of very sick people, and before me, there was no senior clinician down here. And so I was puzzled that other physicians weren't racing to get to Katherine, but it turns out that they weren't. It was only me that was mad enough to see that. But it was full of opportunity. It's a $45 million a year facility that is superbly placed in the heartland of the poorest health in Australia. And it just hadn't been utilised, and people hadn't really considered this resource that was already there. You didn't need to argue to build a hospital in Katherine, it was already there. It's just about how you utilise it. So getting specialist knowledge there and getting real added value to patients, and then not on top of that is actually slowly but surely developing trusting and long-lasting relationships with Aboriginal people. So when I arrived here, roughly 70 people per month were flown to Darwin. Now it's 25 per month. And this is really important because a lot of Aboriginal people wouldn't turn up to Katherine Hospital because they were terrified that they'd be flown to Darwin. So more Aboriginal people are now showing up here because they know they have a right to say no to being transferred to Darwin. Obviously, there's an enormous savings to the system as well, both in terms of aeromedical resources and also hospital beds in the tertiary facility up in Royal Darwin Hospital. We have significantly more patients accessing care closer to home, and being close to home is really important. So we have increased outpatient specialty capacity here at Katherine Hospital, and Dr. Richard Budd and myself, who are the two physicians here now, have started a comprehensive region-wide outreach model, and we saw 800 people last year in community rather than them having to come into Katherine. And seeing them in community, particularly some of the older people that don't speak any English, you know, you're trying to negotiate some really complex medicine that I find difficult to explain to my parents. Now, you have to remember that languages like Warlpiri only have 500 words. There's no Warlpiri word for ventilator. There's no Warlpiri word for do not resuscitate. So when you're forced to sit down in front of an Aboriginal family and talk about complex care management plans for older people who don't understand English, you realise how easy it is to misportray what Western medicine can do for these people. And so I think, generally speaking, I'm pretty sure that slowly we're definitely improving patient satisfaction. And I think this is clearly documented in our recent success in take-home leave, which I'll show you in a minute. But it's all slow learning on my behalf. So I spent 8 years learning to be a physician. That was hard work. But actually, the problem isn't scientific knowledge that us doctors lack. We lack knowledge of Aboriginal people's culture and language. And that's what I'm really interested in learning now. And in fact, it's a deeply rich and rewarding learning journey that I'm on. So I took this photograph this morning to try and show you practically what I do. I'm trying to learn 5 languages, and I'm not very good at learning languages. And every time, so there's no language courses for Warlpiri, Gurindji, Naliwuru, or Narinman, Dalabon, Yolngu-Mata. There's no way that I can learn language except through the people. And so slowly but surely, I'm learning language. And when I love it. So firstly, when the juniors see me speak language, they're like, oh my goodness, that's amazing. And I'm like, yeah, I speak 20 words of Yolngu and 30 words of Warlpiri and 50 words of Gurindji. So it makes them realize that they have to do the same. But there's nothing better than meeting an old Warlpiri man and saying, how's your loko loko murumuru, which means how's your heart? Is it sick? And their jaw drops because they've never seen a white fella talk Warlpiri. And it opens the door to trust. And just as if I was a doctor that wanted to go and work in Japan, if you're going to go and work in Japan, firstly learn Japanese. There's no difference here. So if you have a group of people that learn a language, then try and speak their language, and it will really open the doors. And the only way that you're going to learn a language is by staying around long enough. And that's the other thing. Once you build these relationships, they're precious foundations upon which we can start to close the gap by building a bit of trust between people. So if you work with Aboriginal people who speak language, honour that language and try and speak it. So this is our take-home leave statistics. This isn't something that I tried to achieve. It was something that was brought to my attention. In 2011, we had the highest take-home leave rates in Australia. So take-home leave is a patient that leaves hospital without telling you that they're going to leave hospital. And so the reasons that someone takes their own leave is because, firstly, your treatment isn't working, or you haven't explained what the illness is, and they think that you're barking up the wrong tree, or they have things that are much higher priority in their life. And so all 3 of these things can be predicted. And my take on it is if someone takes their own leave, then I've failed. Clearly there's a whole lot of interpretation stuff that needs to go on here. And that is the clearest way for me to know that I have failed to actually get engagement. And so I've taken it seriously, and I chased someone down, and we've gone from the highest rate to certainly the lowest rate in the Northern Territory. And in terms of Indigenous populations, I'm led to believe that we now have the lowest rate of any hospital in Australia. And it doesn't feel like it was that hard to achieve. it hasn't been an easy 6 years in Katherine, but to achieve that is just about being respectful to culture. So telehealth is one of the things that we offer, and I put this slide up really to offer a word of caution. A lot of people are turning to telehealth as if it's a panacea. It stops the specialist from realising how far away people live, and it's not face-to-face, and it's not as good as a face-to-face contact. Telehealth is okay when there's no other option. Our outreach service is great, and I'll give you a funny story about outreach. I recently talked to a senior executive at Royal Darwin Hospital that questioned my ideas that people didn't like flying in the wet season, and this lady said to me, everyone knows when you fly in the wet season, you fly above all those storms and it's actually a lot smoother. And I said, you fly in a pressurized aircraft at 10,000 meters. I fly on my outreach at 2,000 meters, and let me assure you, at 2,000 meters, when you fly through a storm, one part of your face is on one window and the other part of your face is on the other window. You get thrown around and it's terrifying. And so a lot of people don't want to travel 800 kilometers to see me. When I ask a patient to travel 800 kilometers to see me, I want to make sure it's worth their while. I don't want to waste their time, because if I waste one person's time, word quickly gets out, don't waste your time with that white fella, he doesn't get it. And that happens quicker than you can click your fingers. So this thing of Aboriginal health paradigm, I just want to touch base on this again, because I think this is the fundamental thing. If we don't understand what a person values as health and well-being, then what are we doing as doctors in a Western medical paradigm? Aboriginal people had very mystical ideas about health. I was recently told that it's very important for me to understand that all my healing powers are in my elbows, and that's traditional healers. They hold their knowledge, and I was told, look after your elbows, Simon. I don't really understand what that means, but I definitely listened, and I clearly said to them, look, I'm a white fella. I believe in my ways, and I believe that my power is in my head, but I really respect what you say, and I'll take note of it. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about it, because the concept of health and well-being is so fundamentally about health of country. So Bulla, so I had to seek permission last night after I talked to Anthony and realised this might be recorded, because Bulla is a very special thing to talk about. So I'm not the custodian of this knowledge, and I don't speak on behalf of it, but I want to let you know, but I was told that ladies aren't allowed to talk about this after. So any ladies in the room are not allowed to talk about Bulla. You can talk about what I talk about, but you're not allowed to mention Bulla's name. Bulla was probably the most important Jawoyn ancestor who came in across the ocean. When he got to Katherine River, he came underneath the ground and he moved up. And where he left the ground, he left sickness country. And this is a map of Bulla sickness country. Now, there's a protocol, Kakadu National Park protocol that I've got here about what to do in Bulla country. And I'll just read something here. So behaviour in sickness country. So this is what tourists are given if they're lucky enough to be given permission to walk on sickness country. So according to Aboriginal tradition, women and children are prohibited from approaching Bulla focal sites. Certain activities such as hunting or harvesting food, swimming in or drinking from nearby waterholes are prohibited. Care must be taken in sickness country to avoid making loud noises, kicking rocks or sticks, or to getting cuts or scratches. This is fundamental to keeping country healthy. And if you don't keep country healthy, you get sick. And this is an absolute belief of every Aboriginal Jawoyn person I've ever met. This is not something to be smiled at or smirked at or laughed at. This is deadly serious. Don't muck with Bulla country. And what's interesting about Bulla country is that it was quickly discovered that the sickness country that was mapped in this map in front of you today correlated exactly with uranium deposits. So that makes you realise how, and then there was a whole lot of battles that the Jawoyn people had with the mining companies to stop them mining, but it was an exact correlation of where the radioactive landmass was. It makes you understand how 65,000 years of living on country can change your understanding of fundamental bits. And maybe it's spoken about in different ways and in the use of mythical understanding, but there's true and rich knowledge in this history. And so sadly, some of you might have realised that fracking has been allowed throughout this country, and it is devastating for Aboriginal people. And further north in Kakadu, this is what happened at the very northern end of Bulla country. And every Aboriginal person I say is absolute. Don't walk on Bulla country. You don't know how to respect it. And this was dug. And I think this is a warning to mankind when we don't listen to and try and interpret ancient knowledge. This was the wrong thing to do. And so when we're talking about advocacy for Aboriginal people, we need to take all of this into account. And if we're seen as condoning things like mining in traditional spaces, we will not be popular. They will not trust us. And it's really hard to get the trust of an Aboriginal person. So I'll just leave you with a bit of a light-hearted thing that I took yesterday. Katherine Hospital bends over backwards to make people feel welcome and at home. It's a small hospital, it's easy to do, we've got a small team and we've got a strong focus on providing culturally safe care. So this is an Aboriginal guy who's in my ward today with febrile neutropenia after some chemotherapy, and he liked Asian-style vegetable soup with each meal, and our kitchen did it immediately. And you'll see the sign down the bottom. This is actually in Creole. When you use them, the pink bottle, you show them respect, like an old sick fella. You've been using this one, that's a pink bottle. And so this is what we do every day in Katherine Hospital, and it's because we're very privileged to work with these people. Of course, Aboriginal Australia is a rich tapestry, and where I grew up in Sydney, all of the culture was dead. The last remaining people on the country that I grew up on were living in Redfern, and it was very hard to tangibly touch it. And in Katherine, I'm lucky enough to still be able to meet people that were born into an Australia where they didn't realise that white people were. And I think from that understanding is a great place to grow a knowledge and understanding of how to bring about equality in terms of health outcomes. So thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Simon. I think we've got a few minutes left before you have to go back to work. Are you willing to take some questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Does anybody, I'm in Melbourne, does anyone in the Melbourne office have a question that they'd like to ask Simon? No questions? What about any of the other sites? You'll have to unmute your microphones. Dyslexic. Dyslexic Anthea on the microphone.
Can I just, it's Joanne from New South Wales. I was just wondering how you deal with gender or, you know, women's business and men's business in the hospital, and whether you have clinicians or nurses that play that important role with regard to women's business.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? So misogyny is a part of Aboriginal culture, and I don't like Donald Trump and I don't condone misogyny, but this is a 65,000-year-old culture where Aboriginal men and women had distinct roles, and there was a hierarchy and it was male-dominated. It is the way it is, and we absolutely never put men in with women. And so we're really sensitive about those issues, and given that there's only a couple of senior doctors here that lead it, it's pretty easy. So I can quickly identify that an old man doesn't really want to talk to a young woman about their health problems. I actually find it personally myself much harder. So there's Richard and I are obviously both male, and so I find it really hard to engage with some of the women who are very shy and don't talk to me. So it's just having a sensitivity around it, and I think that learning a bit of language and understanding a little bit of the local culture can break down those boundaries. And you know, I say, look, I'm a white fella. You don't need to treat me as an Aboriginal man. I'm separate. I'm a doctor. But it's hard. It's always hard.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I just had a question, Simon, actually. We've had a bit of a discussion lately around clinical yarning and the use of clinical yarning in the interaction, but obviously between clinicians and Aboriginal patients. Would you say that's the style that you've adopted or you think about with your patients?
I think when I talk with Aboriginal people, it's a different pace. So it's taken about 15 or 20 years for me to learn it, and I don't really realise it, but I know that the juniors, when they come down, they're like, oh, you do it really differently. And so firstly, I get right down to their level because I know that when they're in bed, they're intimidated. And I try not to make eye contact, and I allow a lot of space for quietness. So you just have to say, do you know that this is what I think you've got? What do you reckon? And then you need to wait for maybe 20 seconds and then you'll hear something. It's a much slower process, but the thing that I've got now that's to my advantage is that just about every single person with a chronic illness in Katherine I know, and they know me or they've heard about me. And so that makes it a lot easier. And one of the other really important things is that you need to understand their tribal and cultural identity, and you need to know where they come from. You need to, even if you don't know why you need to know, ask, because it starts to all kind of come together as a community and you realise how they fit in. So every time I meet an Aboriginal person from the Katherine region, I say, what tribe you're from? And sometimes they say they're a bit Dalabon. I'm like, so your mother and father weren't both Dalabon. How did that work? And so that's a very, very important thing to get straight, and I document it. I say this man's a Dalabon man, but his mother was a Warramungu, for instance. And to me, that means a lot. And I understand how they fit into this landscape and tribally how they identify. I don't know how important that is in places like New South Wales, where tribal identity might not be as strong.
Were there any other questions of the other sides? I just have one other thing as well to ask you about resources. Obviously, the Heart Foundation develops a lot of resources, and we're just currently reviewing what we're doing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander patients. But what do you do in Katherine to help the patients understand? I guess about
I feel really excited about the technological space that we're in. I see a lot of opportunity. It's not realised opportunity yet, but it's opportunity nonetheless. So I would love to see a language app on an iPad, and I'd love to see an anatomy app on an iPad with 15 different languages. It would really help me. It's a fun thing to do, to learn language with your patient, and to actually be able to provide an iPad and show people, their parts of their body. So you'll be, particularly with more remote living Aboriginal people, you'll be amazed at how easy it is to be misunderstood. And I experience that still all the time. I think that I've really got the message home and then find out that they're thinking the problems in a completely different part of their body. It still happens all the time, even though I've learned a bit of language. So I think communication tools are particularly important. And on the ward, what I would like to see from an IT infrastructure point of view, I'd love to see iPads available so people can FaceTime their family members back home. So Aboriginal people are really, really avid uptakers of this technology. They love phones and facial recognition technology because the most important thing to an Aboriginal person is their family. It's so much stronger than in our culture. And for them to be able to talk when they're a long way away is very comforting. And so they all have FaceTime and they all talk to each other on FaceTime. So rather than using phones, I'd like to do away with the phones in our ward and just have iPads so that they can FaceTime.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting. I think
and also just on from that, if you've got a cardiac surgeon that's going to replace a valve, introduce them via FaceTime before you meet them, it'll make them feel more comfortable about coming down. It'll put them in a context that they're not, because so you have to understand their mindset. They come from a community where they know everybody, and their grandparents have known everybody, and their great 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 grandparents have known everybody. They're totally tight, and they're going to this completely bizarre city that possibly for the first time, that is terrifying. So just to be able to put a human face to that, I think would resolve quite a bit of anxiety.
So do you use that when you send patients to Adelaide or Darwin?
I try to. It's hard to get the specialist's time at the other end. But when it's a really big procedure in a young person, even if you could introduce them to their ALO down south. So in Darwin, there's a bit more of an understanding and less of an ambiguity about going up to Darwin. People either know that they want to or they don't, and it doesn't matter who they talk to. But Adelaide, everyone's terrified to go to Adelaide. It's just another. It's cold. It's foreign. It's yeah.
Great challenges you have. Look, I think we have taken up the time that we arranged to speak with you, so I did want to thank you.
Thank you
for everything. It really is appreciated, and I know everybody here. And we'll just clap you, and you can imagine we're very.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. We'll let you get back to your
Thanks
work,
very much.
and we do appreciate it.
Thank you. See you guys.